September 1882. A gold pocket watch glimmers against the jagged bone-white rocks of Georgian Bay, a young man's last earthly treasure, traded for a miracle. Behind him, 5 frozen bodies lie silent in a battered lifeboat, while the vengeful waves of Lake Huron whisper a chilling secret. How did a vessel once resurrected from the depths become a floating tomb for over 120 souls? Was it the sudden wrath of a white squall, or a fatal chain of greed hidden beneath the ship's wooden ribs? As we retrace the SS Asia's final coordinates, we uncover a disaster by design and a survival that defied every law of nature. But the darkest mystery isn't the sinking itself, it's the haunting silence that only 2 survivors carried to their graves. What truly happened in those final desperate hours on the water, and what secrets did they bury beneath the waves? Stay with us until the very end as we uncover the truth that history tried to forget, the lost testimony of the SS Asia. On paper, the Asia was a standard-issue workhorse of the Gilded Age, a wooden-hulled, propeller-driven steamer commissioned in 1873 measuring 138 feet in length with a 25-foot beam. The ship was originally built to operate in the Welland Canal and other enclosed waterways of the time. Later, its owners modified it for service on the vast Great Lakes. So she was a ship living on borrowed time thrust into service as a fatal replacement for the steamer Manitoulin, which had recently been destroyed by fire. This sudden administrative shift forced the Asia to absorb a massive, disorganized backlog of winter supplies, heavy industrial freight, and nearly 100 passengers, a load that far exceeded her designed stability limits. The overcrowding was so extreme that the crew resorted to converting lounges, sofas, and even armchairs into makeshift berths, effectively packing the upper decks with human weight and creating a dangerously top-heavy profile. Technically, the Asia was a resurrected vessel, having foundered and sunk in the St. Mary's River just 1 year prior in 1881. While she had been refitted, this restoration created a lethal illusion of sturdiness. In truth, the year she spent submerged in the freshwater of the Great Lakes had initiated a process of invisible decay. The iron-to-wood fasteners, the critical bolts and spikes holding her massive oak ribs to the hull planking, had undergone silent, deep-seated oxidation. As the iron rusted, it expanded, crushing the surrounding wood fibers and allowing moisture to seep into the heart of the timber. This resulted in a condition known in 19th century maritime circles as sick wood, a structural rot that stripped the hull of its essential tensile strength. Without this integrity, the ship lost its elasticity, the ability to flex and recover under the rhythmic torsion and pounding of a massive gale. Powering this compromised aging frame was a single-cylinder high-pressure engine that was notoriously underpowered for the ship's displacement. While this engine could propel the Asia with grace through sheltered bays, it lacked the raw mechanical muscle required to maintain headway against the towering rapid-fire waves characteristic of Georgian Bay. When a ship is underpowered, it cannot keep its bow pointed into the wind. It becomes sluggish, vulnerable to being broached, caught sideways in the troughs of the waves. This mechanical inadequacy was further compounded by a catastrophic error in weight distribution. By stacking heavy, dense winter cargo on the passenger decks while utilizing lighter, porous cordwood fuel in the lower bunkers, the crew inadvertently shifted the ship's metacentric height, the measure of its initial static stability, to a breaking point. The SS Asia was no longer a seaworthy vessel. She had become a top-heavy pendulum, whose center of gravity was so precarious that the first major roll would inevitably become her last. On the morning of September 13th, 1882, the dock of the Northwestern Transportation Company was a scene of organized chaos. The air was thick with the copper tang of horse sweat, the pungent aroma of fresh-cut cordwood, and the cacophony of a civilization racing against the frost. As the gaslights flickered against the rising mist, the harbor was a theater of desperation. This was the final critical lifeline before the Great Lakes transformed into an impenetrable sheet of ice, cutting off the isolated outposts of the north. Every crate of flour, every barrel of salted pork, and every bale of winter clothing carried the weight of survival for the merchants of the North Shore. But beneath this logistical necessity pulsed the true heart of the disaster, the Gilded Age Greed. In this era of rapid northern expansion, the boundary between ambitious commerce and criminal negligence was non-existent. For the shipping magnates, the SS Asia was no longer a vessel. She was a floating ledger. The northern extraction fever was at its peak, and the booming lumber camps required more than just supplies. They required raw, thundering muscle. This is why, amidst the chaos of the gangways, 4 teams of massive workhorses were being forced into the shadows of the main deck. These beasts, destined for the grueling, soul-crushing labor of the winter timber stands, were joined by 5 cows consigned to a hopeful farmer on Manitoulin Island. Tethered at the dock all day, the animals were agitated, their restless mooing and the frantic stamping of heavy hooves against the wooden planks adding a primal layer of anxiety to the ship's vibration. From a technical perspective, these animals represented live weight, a shifting, unpredictable mass located high above the waterline. Yet, in the eyes of the company, they were merely high-value freight that had to be squeezed onto the deck at any cost. This atmosphere of profit over people was personified in the man standing on the wooden bridge, Captain John Savage. Savage was a man caught between the barometer and the bottom line. As he looked out over the Bruce Peninsula, the wind began to strum through the ship's rigging like a funeral dirge. It is a haunting historical fact that official storm warnings were already in effect. The mercury was dropping with terrifying speed, signaling a cyclonic gale brewing over the open waters of Lake Huron. Savage knew this, but he also knew that to stay in port meant stagnant capital for his employers and a blemish on his record for timeliness. In a fateful silent executive decision, he chose to suppress the warnings. He ordered the lines cast off, signing a death warrant for 125 souls in the name of the schedule. The passengers settling into their berths were never told that the horizon they were steaming toward was a trap. Among the crowd navigating this labyrinth of crates and shadows was Miss Christine Morrison. Her presence on the Asia was a masterclass in tragic irony. Only 18 years old and traveling alone, she had arrived at the docks that morning intended for the Northern Belle. Having missed that departure by a mere handful of minutes, she had spent the day in Owen Sound, eventually booking a last-minute passage on the Asia. As she stepped onto the deck, dodging the swinging cargo nets, she felt a sudden surge of relief. There, barking orders to the stevedores, was her cousin John MacDonald, the ship's first mate. In the eyes of a young woman facing the dark expanse of a September gale, the sight of a family member in a position of authority suggested that the ship was in safe, capable hands. It was a deadly misconception. MacDonald was as much a cog in the corporate machine as the engine itself, bound by the same relentless pressure, to sail. As the clock ticked toward midnight, Duncan Tinkus and his uncle J.H. Tinkus finally boarded. Arriving late allowed them to miss the worst of the dockside bedlam, but it also meant they did not see the sheer volume of cargo that had been piled onto the passenger decks. They navigated the maze of crates that now rose like wooden walls outside the cabins, finally reaching their berth. It felt snug and warm, a deceptive sanctuary against the rising wind. They were completely unaware that the very bales lashed just inches from their heads were radically shifting the ship's metacentric height. By maritime law, the Asia was already a top-heavy pendulum. With every inch of freight added to the upper levels, the ship's ability to right itself from a roll was being systematically destroyed. The departure, at 5 minutes past midnight on September 14, 1882, marked the beginning of a deceptive peace. For the first 8 miles of the voyage, the SS Asia hugged the jagged lee of the Bruce Peninsula, finding a temporary sanctuary from the burgeoning storm. In these sheltered waters, the lake remained eerily calm, masked by the massive limestone cliffs that blocked the worst of the northern winds. To the passengers huddled in their berths, the gentle vibration of the engine suggested a routine transit. But for Captain Savage, standing on the bridge, the calm was a ticking clock. He knew that once they cleared the tip of the peninsula, they would be stepping out of the shadows and directly into the path of a monster. In a final attempt to prepare the vessel for the open water, Savage ordered a stop at Presque Isle, near Gravelly Bay. Here, the crew performed a rapid-fire refueling operation, relaying a full load of cordwood fuel into the firehold deck. Historically, this was a calculated move by Savage to improve the ship's miserable roll. He hoped that the heavy, dense wood stowed low in the hull would act as makeshift ballast, lowering the ship's center of gravity and providing the stability needed to survive the crossing. It was a desperate effort to fix a fundamental engineering flaw. The ship was already fundamentally compromised by the sheer volume of freight piled onto the upper decks. From a technical standpoint, this created a lethal mechanical paradox. While the cordwood was added below the passenger deck above, was already a warehouse of heavy winter stocks, crates, and livestock. This led to a catastrophic shift in the ship's metacentric height, GM. In naval architecture, the GM is the distance between the center of gravity and the metacenter. It dictates how quickly and effectively a ship rights itself after a wave pushes it over. By stacking massive weight high on the deck, the Asia's righting arm was crippled. The ship was no longer a stable platform. It had become a top-heavy pendulum with a dangerously long, sluggish roll. This vulnerability was exponentially worsened by what mariners fear most, the free surface effect. When heavy cargo, or in this case shifting livestock and unlashed crates, is placed on an upper deck, without absolute security, it creates dynamic instability. As the Asia began to encounter the first swells, the freight on the passenger deck showed a marked tendency to shift toward the downhill side of the roll. Once the weight moved, the center of gravity moved with it, pinning the ship down and preventing it from recovering its upright position. It was a disaster by design, a fatal chain of events where every roll of the ship brought it inches closer to a permanent capsize. The moment the SS Asia cleared Wingfield Point, the last protective embrace of the Bruce Peninsula vanished, leaving the wooden steamer utterly exposed to the predatory maw of northern Lake Huron. It was here that the vessel encountered the true monster of Huron, a meteorological ambush known as a white squall. Unlike oceanic tempests that telegraph their arrival through hours of gathering gloom, a Great Lakes white squall is a violent localized phenomenon that can materialize in less than 30 minutes. Fueled by the rapid collision of frigid Arctic air masses with the relatively warm, shallow waters of Georgian Bay, it creates a localized vacuum of screaming winds and blinding vertical spray. This atmospheric entrapment completely outmaneuvered Captain Savage's decades of seasoned experience. By the time the mercury in the ship's barometer bottomed out, the Asia was already paralyzed in a cauldron of white foam and cyclonic gusts that stripped the visibility to zero. To understand why this specific stretch of water is historically christened the graveyard of the Great Lakes, one must look beneath the surging surface at the bay's unique bathymetry. The underwater landscape of Georgian Bay is a chaotic, jagged mosaic of deep limestone trenches and shallow, razor-sharp reefs. This geography creates a deadly resonance with the surface water. In such a narrow, constricted corridor, the waves do not develop into the long, predictable swells found in the Atlantic. Instead, they transform into short and steep seas, massive vertical pillars of water that strike with the rapid-fire frequency of a jackhammer. For a top-heavy, notoriously underpowered wooden vessel like the Asia, these waves provided zero recovery time. Before the compromised hull could even begin to right itself from one impact, the next mountain of water was already hammering the starboard rail, burying the steering pole in freezing spray and pinning the ship into a permanent, agonizing list. Inside the cramped cabins, the atmosphere of snug security dissolved into a claustrophobic nightmare. Christine Morrison, already weakened by the ship's earlier sluggish motion, was now gripped by a violent, debilitating seasickness that rendered her nearly immobile. To her, every lurch of the ship felt like a terminal plunge into a bottomless abyss. Meanwhile, Duncan Tinkus, who had remarkably managed to sleep through the initial onset of the gale, was jolted awake not by the screaming wind, but by a sound far more ominous, the rhythmic, bone-shaking thudding of shifted cargo. The free surface effect was now in its most lethal terminal phase. The massive workhorses and cattle trapped in their improvised close confinement stalls on the main passenger deck were being tossed like playthings. Each time the ship rolled, hundreds of pounds of panicked living weight slammed against the wooden bulkheads, the momentum dragging the Asia deeper into the troughs of the sea and preventing the engine from gaining any leverage against the wind. In a state of sheer, cold-blooded desperation, First Mate John McDonald realized the vessel had reached its structural breaking point. Under the cover of a pitch-black darkness, he led a frantic deck crew in a grisly mathematical operation of weight shedding. They began hacking at the lashings and heavy chains of the livestock, forcibly driving the terrified horses and cows overboard into the boiling, freezing surf. It was a brutal sacrifice, the lives of the animals offered up in a desperate bid to save the 125 souls on board. When a wretchedly ill Christine Morrison, disturbed by the thundering hooves and shouting, opened her cabin door to inquire about the terrifying commotion, McDonald lied to her face to prevent a catastrophic mass panic. He claimed they were merely untying the cattle to keep them calm, even as the valuable animals were being swept away by the rearing graybeards of the bay. Yet, as the last of the horses vanished into the blackness, the expected relief never came. The sick wood of the Asia's hull was already groaning under the immense torsion of the shifting load, and the monster of Huron was only beginning its final lethal assault. By 11 a.m. on September 14th, the SS Asia had reached its ultimate breaking point. The transition from a struggling vessel to a doomed wreck was marked by a catastrophic loss of hydrodynamic control. As the underpowered engine failed to maintain enough steerage way, the ship finally broached, caught sideways in the cavernous troughs between the towering peaks of Georgian Bay. For a top-heavy wooden steamer, this was the terminal scenario. With a sickening groan of shifting timber, the Asia rolled onto her beam ends, tilting so far that the deck was nearly vertical, pinning her against the unrelenting weight of the water. From an engineering perspective, the Asia's fate was sealed the moment the lake breached the firehold. In a 19th century steamship, the boiler is the beating heart. Once the freezing lake water flooded the coal furnaces, it triggered an immediate and irreversible loss of steam pressure. This didn't just stop the propeller, it extinguished the ship's very soul. Without the kinetic energy of steam, the Asia was instantly transformed into nothing more than a dead log, a hollow wooden box adrift in a vortex. The crew was plunged into a state of absolute mechanical impotence. Without engine power to head into the wind or steam-powered pumps to clear the rising water, they could only watch as their ship was systematically dismantled by the energy of the lake. The atmosphere on deck dissolved into a fractured landscape of human despair. The organized bedlam of the Owen Sound docks had been replaced by the unfiltered chaos of the dying. In the shadow of the rearing graybeards, many passengers surrendered to the inevitable, collapsing onto their knees in fervent, desperate prayer. Others, driven by a primal survival instinct, engaged in a frantic, disorganized scramble for life. Preservers, cork belts that offered more of a psychological comfort than actual buoyancy in such a violent surf. Tragically, the very safety measures designed to save them became useless. The 3 lifeboats remained lashed to their davits or were smashed against the hull. The waves were so steep and the list so extreme that any traditional attempt to launch them would have resulted in the boats being dashed to kindling before they even touched the water. The final moments of the SS Asia were as agonizing as they were swift. The hull, weakened by sick wood and structural rot, could no longer support the weight of the water filling the aft compartments. The ship began to settle stern, first her bow rising into the air like a desperate finger pointing toward a sunless sky. As the stern was dragged down by the engine's weight, the massive internal air pressure trapped in the hull had nowhere to go. With a sound described by witnesses as a series of muffled explosions, the superstructure and hurricane deck shattered, tearing away from the hull as it descended. The Great Lakes had finally claimed their prize. The Asia vanished into the depths, leaving nothing behind but a churning circle of wreckage and 125 souls screaming into the roar of the gale. As the ship's stern vanished beneath the waves, a field of debris and screaming souls was left in its wake. Among the wreckage, the fatal lottery of the lifeboats began. The Asia had been equipped with 3 boats, but in the structural chaos of the sinking, their design became a matter of life and death. 2 of these vessels were standard double-ended wooden boats, simple shells without buoyancy chambers. As they were pulled into the churning vortex of the sinking ship, they were instantly overloaded by panicked passengers and flipped, dumping their human cargo into the 0-degree water where they were never seen again. But there was a 3rd boat. By a stroke of technical luck, this was a self-righting lifeboat equipped with internal air chambers that made it virtually unsinkable. This single 18-foot wooden craft would become the stage for a haunting process of elimination, a purification by death. Duncan Tinkus, a strong swimmer, managed to reach the craft first, pulling himself aboard, only to find a scene of absolute misery. Shortly after, Christine Morrison was pulled from the crest of a wave by the only boat that could actually perform the task it was built for. Under the shattered leadership of Captain John Savage, 18 people initially managed to scramble into or cling to the side of the lifeboat. This was far beyond its safe capacity, and the monster of Huron was not finished with them. What followed was a brutal application of the rule of remaining. The first massive sea that struck the boat capsized it entirely, tossing all 18 souls into the freezing surf. When the boat righted itself, only 14 managed to climb back in. The lake had claimed its first 4 victims in a matter of seconds. The storm showed no mercy. A second capsize soon followed. This time, as the boat rolled over and dumped its cargo, the toll grew heavier. Christine and Duncan, realizing the interior of the boat was a death trap of flailing limbs, chose to hang onto the looped life ropes fastened to the gunnels. They remained in the water, their bodies numbing, acting as human stabilizers as the boat overturned 4 more times. Each time the vessel righted itself, fewer voices cried out. By the end of the second capsize, there were 12. After the third, only 10. Finally, a rogue wave rolled the boat one last time. It recovered slowly, almost full of water, and as the survivors looked around, they realized the group had been whittled down to a desperate 7. These 7 represented the final outpost of the SS Asia: Christine Morrison, Duncan Tinkus, Captain Savage, First Mate John McDonald, 2 unnamed lumberjacks, and a gentleman named Mr. Little. They were the chosen few, but their ordeal was transitioning from a battle against the waves to a battle against their own failing bodies. This is where the mystery of silence begins to take root. History often sanitizes these stories, but we must ask the analytical question. In those first hours, when 18 desperate people fought for a seat on a boat designed for 12, what truly happened? Was the reduction in numbers solely the work of the waves, or did the primal instinct for self-preservation play a darker role in the shadows of the spray? There are no records of the struggle, only the silent testimony of the 2 who walked away. As night began to fall on September 14th, the psychological battle intensified. In the distance to the east, a glimmer of hope appeared, the rhythmic blink of the Bing Inlet Lighthouse. It was a miraculous sight that breathed life back into the freezing group. Under the direction of First Mate McDonald, the 7 survivors used whatever they had: Cap's shoes and cupped hands to bail the boat dry. The psychological anchor of the lighthouse gave them a reason to keep moving, even as their muscles began to seize from hypothermia. To keep their spirits from shattering, McDonald led the group in song. Imagine the scene: 7 ghosts on a dark, violent sea, their voices thin and croaking against the roar of the wind, singing "Pull for the Shore" and "In the Sweet By and By." These hymns were not just music. They were a desperate attempt to remain human in a situation that was stripping them of everything. But as the wind shifted, blowing the boat away from the lighthouse and back toward the open lake, the songs died out. The psychological blow was too much for some to bear. The physical purification resumed, but this time it was silent and slow. The first to succumb was one of the lumberjacks, his heart simply stopping from the cold. 2 hours later, his companion leaned back against the side of the boat and died. Their bodies remained in the bottom of the craft, a grim reminder of the stakes. Next was Mr. Little, who had spent the entire trip wishing he had never boarded the Asia. His wish was granted as he breathed his last notes of "In the Sweet By and By." Then the tragedy struck closer to Christine. Her cousin, First Mate John McDonald, the man who had lied to her to keep her calm and led the songs of hope, finally gave out. He died with his weary head supported by Christine, his emaciated body finally surrendering to the Great Lakes. By dawn, even the authority of the ship was gone. Captain Savage, after responding one last time to a porter's phantom call in his delirium, fell into a deep sleep, from which he never woke. The morning of September 15th dawned sunny and beautiful, a cruel contrast to the carnage. The lake was calm, the sun was warm, but on the lifeboat of the SS Asia, only two remained: Christine Morrison and Duncan Tinkis. They sat amongst the corpses of their leaders and companions, two 18-year-olds who had survived a culling that 123 others did not. The rule of remaining had reached its final chilling conclusion. They were no longer passengers or survivors. They were the living archives of a nightmare floating toward an unknown shore with a cargo of the dead. The dawn of September 16th, 1882 brought a cruel irony to the two teenagers adrift on Georgian Bay. The storm had spent its fury, leaving behind a lake as smooth as glass and a sun that mocked the carnage of the previous 48 hours. Driven by the remnants of the current and a lingering spectral luck, the lifeboat of the SS Asia finally scraped against the jagged rocks of an uninhabited island near Point O'Barrel. For Christine Morrison and Duncan Tinkis, this was not a triumphant landing. It was a macabre arrival at the threshold of a new nightmare. To regain use of the small craft and search for help, they were first forced to perform a task that would shatter the psyche of any seasoned mariner. They had to physically heave the 5 frozen, waterlogged bodies of their companions, including Christine's cousin, John MacDonald, and Captain Savage, out of the boat and onto the shore. It was a cold, mechanical necessity, a final weight-shedding required for their own survival. However, once the boat was cleared, the reality of their physical degradation set in. Their hands were raw, their bodies racked by hypothermia, and their muscles refused to obey. After a few agonizing attempts to row toward the mainland, they collapsed back onto the island's shore, surrendered to the wild. They survived those first hours by scouring the brush for wild berries, a primitive sustenance that kept their organs functioning, while they waited for a miracle that logic suggested would never come. The miracle arrived in the form of a small sailboat belonging to an indigenous couple navigating the coastal waters. In a detail that borders on the supernatural accounts, suggests the woman was struck by a sudden, inexplicable premonition, and insisted her husband turn their vessel toward the seemingly desolate island. There they found the 2 ghosts of the SS Asia. But even in this moment of salvation, the harsh reality of 1882, commerce remained. Duncan Tinkis, realizing they needed a concrete incentive for the long journey to Parry Sound, produced his last vestige of the Gilded Age, a solid gold watch. This exchange is deeply symbolic. The gold watch, an emblem of status, time, and material wealth, was traded for the only currency that mattered the remaining minutes of their lives. It was the final Gilded Age transaction of the SS Asia, stripped of its corporate greed and reduced to a primal barter for breath. The return to Parry Sound on Sunday was a scene of Gothic horror. When the small sailboat glided into the harbor, the town was already in mourning. The Asia had been missing long enough for the company to assume total loss. As Christine and Duncan were helped onto the docks, the crowd watched in stunned, rhythmic silence. They weren't seeing survivors. They were seeing people who had literally returned from the land of the dead. Yet for those expecting a Hollywood ending, a romantic union, or a grand public celebration, the reality was stark and hollow. The trauma of the SS Asia did not bond them. It repelled them. Christine Morrison, her spirit broken and her body failing, remained bedridden for 2 weeks before retreating to her family home, a shadow of the 18-year-old who had missed the Northern Belle. Duncan Tinkus, driven perhaps by a desperate need to find closure or fulfill a final duty, did not rest. He joined the official rescue tug that steamed back to the island to recover the 5 bodies they had left behind. This lack of closure highlights the primitive nature of 1882 maritime standards. Unlike today's rigorous tracking, the ship's manifest was a shambles of unrecorded names and +1s. To this day, the exact death toll remains a mystery. There were no black boxes, no satellite pings, and no regulatory bodies to demand justice for the dozens of unnamed souls, the poor laborers and immigrants who occupied the lowest decks. The injustice of their anonymity is the final lingering tragedy of the Asia. In the years that followed, the psychological toll of the disaster manifested in a profound mutual silence. Historians note that Christine and Duncan met only 2 times for the remainder of their lives. When they did, the SS Asia was never mentioned. Today, we would recognize this as severe PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. For them to speak of the waves, the singing in the dark, or the weight of the bodies was to invite the monster of Huron back into their lives. They chose a self-imposed amnesia as a survival mechanism. Their lives remained forever tethered to that September gale. Duncan Tinkus passed away in 1910 at the young age of 38, his health likely compromised by the extreme exposure he endured. Christine Morrison lived much longer, passing away in 1937 at the age of 74, having carried the secret testimony of the Asia into the 20th century. The story of the SS Asia is more than a shipwreck. It is a dark parable of an era where profit was weighed against human life and found wanting. It reminds us that behind every heroic survival story lie the ghosts of the nameless, whose screams were drowned out by the roar of the lake and the silence of the companies that sent them to their graves. As we look out over the calm waters of Georgian Bay today, we must remember that beneath the beauty lies a graveyard built on the broken ribs of the Asia, a monument to the cost of a schedule that could not be missed. Finally, before closing today's message, thank you for walking with me through the icy veils of spray from 1882. Let us take a moment of silence to remember the 123 souls who would never again see the light of Parry Sound. Their names may have been lost in a sparse passenger list, but their memory endures beneath the waves. If you have maritime mysteries or stories of your own, please share them in the comments below. If this journey moved you, I invite you to share, and follow for our next deep dive. Until we meet again, stay safe and remember the nameless. Thank you.